we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. Come on in. So for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And if you're interested in learning more, we have a website on the bottom, nativeland.ca. And in addition to providing a land acknowledgement, we also try to build partnerships with Indigenous communities. We do some work up in Iqaluit in the north, as well as trying to form collaborations here in Toronto to think about how we can be better stewards of our land. So who are we? So quick introduction to the University of Toronto Trash Team. So we are a group of mainly early career researchers and students. We are not just University of Toronto. There's people on our team that are at different universities across Toronto. So we have people from Scarborough as well as Mississauga, in addition to Toronto Metropolitan University and York. We also have had some people volunteer that come from different parts of the world that have just been interested in doing stuff with us online. So we have a pretty big reach. We started in 2017, and we really had one goal, and that is basically to increase waste literacy to reduce plastic pollution. And we do that in different ways, and that's through community outreach, which includes our Let's Chat Literacy series. It also includes educational programs. Rafaela runs school programs. She was in a 5th grade classroom today, as well as our solutions-based research projects, which is mostly what you're going to learn about tonight. So I also am a researcher here at University of Toronto. I run a research lab that's about 2 floors down, really literally maybe right underneath us. So some of the work that you'll be hearing are from grad students that are within the lab. But I think everyone who's speaking tonight also has a hand in the U of T trash team, some of which are founding members and have been really instrumental to helping us build our team and keep our team going. So I'm going to introduce first our first panel. So we have 2 panels tonight. One is on quantifying plastic pollution to inform solutions, and the second one will be about the fate and effects of plastic pollution. And I'll introduce the 6 speakers, but I'll introduce each right before they come up for their panel. So our first panel is going to be, as I said, on quantifying plastic pollution in order to inform solutions. So the first speaker will be Alice Zhu. She's here in the front row. Alice is a PhD candidate at U of T. She's in my lab, and she uses a combination of field sampling, laboratory analysis, and empirical modeling to answer questions pertaining to the sources, transport, and fate of plastic pollution. Alice is a bit of a force of nature, doing a lot of different research on this issue. She's also very interested in connections between plastic pollution, carbon cycling, and climate change. And she's really been a strong advocate for the environment, both in our community in Toronto as well as beyond. So she's been to COP21, was that the one you were at? And so she's been a big advocate for climate change. So she will speak first. Our second speaker will be Gloria Wong. Gloria is a PhD student. She used to be in our lab, but she has since left us for UT Scarborough, where she works with Myrna Simpson, looking at soil. And she received her bachelor's from U of T in our department in ecology and evolutionary biology. And she previously worked in our lab studying the sources of foam litter and the fate of microplastics in water columns. So she was hired as a summer researcher working for the lab, but also with the U of T trash team about the work that she will discuss. So I will not divulge what she will talk about, but we do miss her so now that she's across the city. And then last but not least is Hannah de Frond. And Hannah, I'm struggling, there we go. So Hannah is on Zoom. So actually I think I can put her picture up here. So Hannah, can you turn your camera on, please? There she is in BC. So Hannah works in collaboration with the U of T trash team as well as the Ocean Conservancy. And together we started the International Trash Trap Network. But Hannah used to be a researcher in our lab, and she's done a lot of work on building methods to quantify both microplastics and macroplastics. Some of these have been turned in standard methods in the state of California and are currently being used, which were informed by policy. And now she is building this International Trash Trap Network where we're trying to have people quantifying and characterizing litter in trash traps around the world, and then quantifying our impact globally through the International Coastal Cleanup. So she will talk about that work. Hannah received her master's in marine environmental management from the University of York in UK. She came here to do, I think it was a 2-week internship many years ago, and we roped her in and kept her, even though now she's in BC. But we still work very closely with her. So we're going to start with this panel. Alice, you were up first, so I'm going to put your talk on the screen. And then once you've given your presentation, find a seat and you'll wait until all 3 are done, and then we'll do a Q&A. And I'm gonna have probably some technical issues for a second, but I'm gonna do the best I can here while I pull up your talk. Presenters notes. There are presenters notes. You want them? Didn't memorize your presentation.
Try to say that so people, yeah, this is supposed to check because people in the at home, so they can.
So like not in front of the laptop.
No, you can, it's just because if you go too close to the screen, the owl doesn't follow you that well. They won't, you know.
Okay, and you have 8 minutes.
Hi everyone, my name is Alice. Thank you for the intro, Chelsea. So today I'll be speaking to you about local plastic emissions in the city of Toronto. And what you'll take away from this talk is that there's a lot of plastic leaking into the city from many different sources all the time. But we can do something about it. So one of the objectives of my PhD research is to quantify sources of plastic pollution locally, and to use this to inform policy. So why is it important to understand the sources of plastic pollution? Knowing which sources are the largest helps us to inform policy, because if we know which sources are the most responsible for a lot of the pollution that we see, we can target those, prioritize. And what I mean by emissions are their inputs into the environment. So this term has also been used to describe greenhouse gases. So we say greenhouse gas emissions, and the plastic field also uses that. And so for instance, there's different types of pollution producing activities, and they generate different types of plastic. For example, washing machines are a sort of activity that generates pollution, and they input fibers into wastewater, and then that eventually reaches our environment. But there's many more sources. So for a generic city, there are, for these guidelines that we developed for to inform policy, we have 12 generic sources that we considered. Specifically, they are paint shedding from the exteriors of houses, road markings. Chelsea, do you turn off the light?
Progress.
Light, yes.
I'll just keep going. Paint shedding from the exteriors of houses, road markings, littering, which includes other forms of mismanaged waste, which is waste that leaks from waste management systems. The shedding of rubber infill from artificial turf. Did I forget road markings? Yeah, that's road markings. And then shedding of rubber from turf. Tire dust from airplane and on-road vehicles. Foam loss from construction activities. Pellet loss from industry. Textile pollution, agricultural activities. Textile pollution from washing machines and dryers. And microbead emissions from cosmetic products. Foam, dock foam releases, derelict fishing gear, and paint shedding from aquatic vessels. Oh, that was a lot. But for Toronto, some of these sources don't occur. So for 2020, we did not include agriculture microbeads because they've already been banned, and dock foam, because there's no unencapsulated dock foam in Toronto. So, and then for removals, we quantified 2 types of removal activities: community cleanups and sea bins, to show what the city is doing already to combat plastic after it's entered the environment. So now I'll share 3 main takeaways from this project. The first is that we quantify the sources, and now we can prioritize the ones that are the largest. So here I'm showing you the 3 main sources of plastic pollution to the city. And the first one is littering or mismanaged waste. It's not just littering, but also overflowing trash cans, litter leaking from garbage trucks. Those are all sort of what we call mismanaged waste. So that's the largest source. The second is artificial turf infill, which is surprising because I actually didn't know before this project that Toronto had that many turf fields, artificial turf fields. But we have a lot, and the plastic is leaking from them. And finally, house paint. The second takeaway is that our data allows emission reduction targets to be set. So the city is already doing this for greenhouse gases. It's in its net zero strategy, and Transform TO has emission reduction targets for greenhouse gases. But for plastic, we can do the same thing. This is because our project allows a baseline to be set. We know how much plastic is escaping into the environment for a certain year, which is right now. So if you want to set a target for the future, we can do that now. And that's very powerful because it allows us to keep plastic out of the environment and protect the health of ecosystems and living organisms. And the final takeaway from this project is that we need to turn off the tap on plastic, focus on reducing at the source, because what we found was that sources, the magnitude of the sources is many, many, many times greater than what the city is currently doing to remove plastic. So this means that we need to prioritize reduction at the source, or by turning the tap off plastic, if we want to achieve any hypothetical target. But also removals, the thing about removals is that they're not perfect because the plastic has already entered the environment for an unknown amount of time before you remove it. And during that time, it may have already caused harm and we don't know. So that's why reducing at the source is very important. Kind of like turning off the tap before you mop the spill. So what can we, as in me and you, do about plastic pollution in the city? So in the trash team's school curricula for classrooms, we often talk about this, is that different groups have different responsibilities when it comes to reducing plastic, tackling plastic, the plastic issue. So for instance, individuals can spread awareness of the issue among their friends and family and advocate for policies that tackle plastic pollution at the source. Communities can also do that, and they can organize cleanups and other events that bring people together. Companies can design plastic products to be reused and not discarded after a single use, and fund extended producer responsibility or EPR initiatives such as blue box recycling programs and container deposit schemes. And governments can introduce legislation that tackles plastic pollution at its source and collaborate with communities to collect trash already in the environment. One of my big pet peeves that I always tell my friends is when people tell me, oh, you study plastic, you're gonna save the world, right? The thing is, one person cannot solve everything. Everyone needs to work together to tackle this issue. So with that, I just want to say thank you for your attention. I hope if you you either feel empowered, or if you don't, at least you took something new away from this presentation. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, it's fine. I'll find it. Oh, wonderful. Okay, so Alice set up a really nice overview on many of the different sources of plastic, and now Gloria is going to talk a bit about a very particular source and the work we can do to prevent one of these, which I think construction foam was on Alice's list. Yeah, there's like no, it's either all or none. I feel like.
Oh, that's good. Is there another one on that side?
Oh, yeah.
There you go. Yeah, it's all right. I mean, it can be dark if there's nothing dark.
Oh, there's a dimmer. Wow, fancy.
Gloria, take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name's Gloria. Thanks for the introduction, Chelsea. Today I'll be talking about a little bit of the research
Yeah, I'm currently just doing a webinar though.
the past year and a bit. Alice mentioned some of the sources and why it's important to focus on the source before the plastic enters the environment. And the specific plastic that I'll be focusing on today is plastic foam litter, and we'll be looking at construction activity?
I'll just have the whole thing and not have soup. That way it's easier.
If somebody on the Zoom is unmuted, if you could mute yourself, that would be wonderful. I did it. Thank you.
Thank you. So plastic foam litter is a significant contributor to surface water marine debris. We know that it's been cited in a lot of papers, it's been found in a lot of bodies of water worldwide. On a national scale, this is the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup data from 2021. Styrofoam pieces are the third most prevalent type of plastic litter, or sorry, just litter in general. And at a local scale, this was some of the pictures I took when I did some preliminary sampling, but we can see there's a lot of foam litter both at the coastlines and more inland in Toronto. All these white or blue pieces are just little bits of styrofoam pieces that are breaking up and getting smaller. So I just want to talk a little bit about the potential plastic types, the plastic foams that are out there. These might be some that you guys are more familiar with, as well as foam consumer protective packaging, you know, the stuff that comes in with your microwaves and your TVs. And this we might be more or less familiar with. How many people have worked with or know what construction foam is? A few hands, yeah, a few hands. So essentially what this is used for, you can see on the two images on the left over there, those are insulation boards that are made of foam and they go within the walls of our buildings. They're probably in the walls in your home and they insulate the building, so they keep us warm, as well as this polyurethane spray foam. So that's the type of plastic that I want to focus on. And the reason we want to focus on this is because there's been a couple of reports in Toronto in the past few years of styrofoam debris entering the environment. You can see this article is from October 2019 and a more recent one in just 2 months ago in September 2022. Essentially, there's a lot of debris coming from construction sites that are entering the environment, and it looks a little bit like snow, and people are complaining about it. So essentially what we wanted to ask was, what are the source contributions of foam litter in the environment? So how much of the foam litter in the environment is from construction foam versus other types of foam, like foam packaging, foam takeout containers, etc. And to answer that, first of all, we can tell on these two pictures, visually, you can see that, you know, the top one's a takeout container and the bottom one's a sort of insulation board, right? It's pretty easy to visually tell what they are. But when you find something like this in the environment, you know, I don't know what source of foam this is from. You know, it's broken up into really, really small pieces. So in order to answer our big question, we need to first ask ourselves, how can we actually distinguish between these different sources? And what's cool about construction foam is that these foams contain a chemical additive. They're called brominated flame retardants. Essentially, it's just like a chemical that was added into these boards, and they decrease the flammability of buildings that they're installed in. So this sets them apart from other types of foams because they have this elemental bromine compound. And that's where it helps me out, because we have this handy dandy device. It's an X-ray fluorescence analyzer, but essentially what it does, it's like a little handheld gun and you scan it against a sample and it tells you how much bromine is in that sample. So that's really useful for us because we can then use bromine as an identifying feature of construction foam. So the first part of this project was building a foam library. So we collected different types of construction foams, different types of meat trays from supermarkets, dock foam from marinas, as well as styrofoam cups. And that was all to tell us with the XRF what range of bromine concentrations can be found specifically within construction foams, as well as other applications of foam. Here, I'm about to show you a figure, but it might look scary, but I just want to point out to you on the x-axis, it's the different types of foam applications, and on the y-axis, it's the proportion of the samples that are either going to be dark blue, which means that they contain bromines, or light blue, which means that they don't have any bromines at all. So we can see in this figure that a lot of the construction and dock foam from the marinas are dark blue, which means that they do contain bromines. Whereas with food packaging and consumer protective packaging, like in the TVs and microwaves, they don't contain any bromines, which is what we expected. But what's good about this XRF analyzer is that they can also tell us what are the specific range of bromine concentration values. So on the left, you can see a couple of dots, and each dot essentially just represents one sample. So for the construction foam, we see that the bromine concentration of these samples fall, majority of them fall between 4,000 and around like 12,000 parts per million of bromines. As well with the foam from the marinas, it falls within that same range. So we can pretty much conclude that a lot of the construction or the foams that are used in dock foam at marinas are construction foam. And then likewise, you can see for food packaging and consumer protective packaging, the values are pretty close to zero, which means that they don't have any bromines. So knowing what the range of these bromines values are is really helpful, because when we're sampling for foam in the environment, we can use that as a identifying feature of whether it's construction foam or not. Okay, so we can then move into our next part of what portion of environmental foam litter actually originates from construction applications. So we did this kind of sampling method in 2 steps. The first was to sample beaches across Lake Ontario, and we wanted to sample for a macro size foam. So any pieces of foam litter that were greater than 1 inch. And then we also wanted to look for micro size foams. So any foams less than 5 millimeters in size from surface water surveys. So this is a manhood trawl, and essentially what it is it's a net that kind of drags alongside a boat and collects debris off the surfaces of the water. So this was done in Lake Ontario, as well as a couple of the local rivers and creeks. And what we find in our graph, on the x-axis, you can see the 3 different beaches that we hit, as well as the proportion of brominated versus non-brominated samples. And we can see that when we take the average across all 3 sites, that 58% of the sampled foam originates from construction sources. So that's more than half. And the reason why we know that they are from construction foam is when we look at this graph, again, each of these dots are individual samples, and this range of values is exactly the same as the range of values that we confirmed in our lab. So these are in fact construction foams that we are finding in the environment. As well, for the micro-sized foam for surface water, we sampled 5 different sites on the x-axis. When we average across all 5 separate sites, 51% of the foam in the environment in the waters are from construction sources. So that's more than half for both the beaches and on the surface waters. So why does this matter? This matters because a lot of the attention right now from the government, all the regulations that are involving polystyrene foam is focused on food serviceware and takeout containers. And although addressing that is super, super important, it's also important to be aware of what the major contributing sources are so we can redirect our efforts appropriately. So with that in mind, going back to the styrofoam snow that we talked about earlier in the reports, that's from a process that's really notorious for releasing a lot of these polystyrene debris. It's called exterior installation finishing systems. I don't know, again, how many people are familiar with this, but essentially you take, when they install the boards into the walls, they're taking these rasps which shave off the surface, and supposedly that helps with the adhesion. But that's a really, really big issue. So what our next steps are to write a policy brief that hopefully will reach a wider audience of the fact that construction foam is a main source of foam litter in the environment, as well as propose a couple of solutions to some construction organizers as well. So essentially we can use these rasps with vacuum attachment. We can kind of enclose this construction sites around so that the litter isn't entering the environment. We can do a better job at cleaning the construction sites, as well as use baskets lined with mesh filters within the storm drains so that they're not entering our storm waters. And with that, thanks for listening. Feel free to ask me any questions. Thank you, Gloria.
Okay, so our final talk of this section is gonna be Hannah de Frond, and this is where we have to do the technology where she's gonna share on Zoom, so just bear with me if for some reason I end up with the wrong screen, but I'm hoping that is not the case. Hannah, go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. I need you to stop sharing first, I think.
Oh, no wonder. Yep, go ahead. Perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. Can you see
For
it?
those of you that just entered, yeah, we can see it perfectly. There are a few chairs up here if you want to, or you can even scoot your chair up closer, so feel free to join in. Okay, Hannah, we can see you and your slides, so go ahead and take it away.
Okay. Hello everyone. So my name is Hannah de Frond, and Chelsea gave me a great introduction, but just as a recap, I'm U of T Trash Tube staff and I coordinate our trash trapping efforts. But today I'll be speaking about plastic pollution and different methods for measurement. So prior to my role with the trash team, I was research staff at U of T, where I spent time in the Rochman Lab measuring plenty of microplastics. And measuring microplastics can be hard. So hopefully in the Rochman Lab, no one ever looks quite as sad as the person in this photo, but it can be quite a laborious process at times, and this is for many different reasons. Firstly, there's lots and lots of particles to count and characterize per sample, and we found in some of the research in the lab this can be up to the thousands. These particles are also buried within environmental samples, so water or sediment or fish tissue, and so we need to spend time extracting these particles from these environmental matrices first. We also want to get information that's actually useful for research and for informing sources, as Gloria just mentioned. So we need to know not only how many particles are present in our samples, but also the size, the color, shape, and the material types to inform sources and then inform solutions. And importantly, one thing that's been a theme throughout a lot of my work is that standard methods do not exist for many types of microplastic analysis. So each lab does things slightly differently, although there's lots of similarities. So this makes the comparison of results and data quite difficult. And so during my time at U of T, through my research, we spent a lot of time looking into some of the common methods used in the lab to analyze microplastics and thought about how we can adapt these and harmonize these methods across different groups. So I'm going to speak about a couple of different projects now that went into that. So one of the methods used in the lab is to identify microplastics by material type. It's called spectroscopy. So this is a very clever technique, but in brief, this instrument uses a laser to produce a signal from a particle, and it produces a spectrum, which there are a few examples on the right. They're just graphs with peaks. And so you can see on the right, there's examples of different types of plastic spectrum. So for example, PP is polypropylene, which is used to make a lot of different types of single-use plastics. And so you can see all of these have different peaks in different places, and that's how we can tell the materials apart. So to identify a material type, we get a spectrum from our particle, and we have a library of reference spectra of known materials, such as these. And so if you get a match between your spectrum and the reference spectrum from the library, then you can identify the material type. So here, this is my spectrum. It matches PVC. And so in this case, we can say the particle is PVC. But the problem with this is that there's not just one standard reference library that everyone uses in the microplastics field. And so different groups use different libraries, and they're not always great for microplastics specifically that come in many different shapes and sizes and different types. So this means that results between different groups are not always the most accurate and also not directly comparable. And so we wanted to improve this. And so we developed our own open access, so publicly available and free libraries of spectra called the Spectral Libraries of Plastic Particles, or SLOP. And this is this is created using an instrument that we call Raman spectrometer. And so we refer to these libraries as SLOP Raman, not to be confused with top ramen, as Chelsea often used to say. So we made a nice photo of it because it became a common theme in this work. So to make these, we collected spectra from everyday items, just as Gloria did with the phone. We did this for items like pens, a CD, bottle caps, plastic cutlery of different shapes and different colors. And we also included spectra from particles that we found from our environmental samples, which have been aged and weathered and fragmented over time. And we called that slop E. And so the aim of these libraries was to create libraries that were representative of the particles that we found in our samples. So we improved our accuracy of material identification. And we also wanted these libraries to be free and used by multiple different researchers to make our results more comparable across groups. So we found that Slop and Sloppy were a great success and we're really happy with them. And so we repeated this again for a different instrument called FTIR. And so to continue with the theme, we named these libraries Flop and Floppy, and I also made another fun image to go along with it. So since these libraries have been published, they've been used by many labs around the world to improve accuracy of spectral matching results, and we've tested this and found that they do improve accuracy, and they also improve the comparability of our data. So we feel like this is a good success and it was a great project to be a part of. So moving on from this, during my time at U of T, we also co-led a study to develop standard methods for measuring microplastics in drinking water. And so this came about in response to a Senate bill as part of the California Safe Drinking Water Act, which requires California to adopt a standard method for monitoring microplastics in drinking water. And these methods did not yet exist for this purpose. So we ran a study to test the effectiveness of current methods used for analyzing microplastics and to provide recommendations for the standard methods that would be used to fulfill this Senate bill. And so to do this, we ran what we called an interlaboratory method validation study. And so we invited a mixture of academic, government, and private sector labs to participate in the study from around the world. We made a set of samples of drinking water spiked with a known content of microplastic, and we sent these out to the different labs, and we asked them to measure the content of the samples and send us back their results. And to do this, we also sent them a standard method to follow to measure the microplastic content of the samples. And so they then reported particle counts, the colors, the shapes, and the material types of each particle that they found in the sample. And the results of this study aim to measure the performance of commonly used methods and also to provide recommendations for the development of the standard methods. And since the study was completed and we published all of our results, our methods have since been published in a policy handbook for the state of California. And these are the first ever standard methods for monitoring microplastics in this way. And so we're very proud of this achievement. And we also hope that this study and the results will be relevant globally because we've demonstrated a process for method development and testing and a process for accrediting labs to do the standard monitoring of microplastics. We also are repeating this study for other environmental compartments, so for sediment, for fish tissue, and for surface waters. And so we hope that this will inform standard methods for those too. And we also hope that this will spread from a local study and local legislation to global and to inform other monitoring legislation around the world. Okay, so moving away from microplastics, specifically in my current role coordinating the Trash Trap Network, I now think more about how to measure big plastic and large plastic debris. So as many of you all know from taking part in the Urban List Challenge and being involved in the trash team, during community cleanup events, we document the weight, the count, and the categories of items collected. And so across the world, data is reasonably comparable from different cleanup activities, and we often find the same types of categories that you can see on the right. However, things get a little bit trickier when we think about using trash traps for cleanup, because trash traps are technologies designed to capture and divert plastics away from our waterways and from our environments. And you can see from the photos here, as a few examples, they're all designed very differently, and they also collect very different types of waste. So there's on the left, there's a sea bin, which we have in Toronto, in Lake Ontario, and it's full of floating microplastics. Whereas the band along, which is on the top right, you can see is full of water bottles. So they're two very different types of plastic pollution. And we wanted to find a way to quantify this collectively. So as part, skipped ahead. So the International Trash Trap Network, or the ITTN, was formed with the aim to increase cleanup efforts, but also to quantify our individual and our collective impact. So we needed to find a way to make the data collected by all of these different devices comparable around the world. And so what we did was we developed harmonized protocols that groups can use for trapping trash. So they follow our methods and they could be adapted for all those different types of the devices. But it means that each group is collecting data that's comparable across different devices and different locations. And it means we can compare the effectiveness of trash traps both locally and globally. And that is one of our goals of the trash team, to think locally, act locally, but think globally. And so through the network, we hope to do this, and we want to harmonize efforts around the world by not only collecting harmonized data, but also sharing knowledge throughout the network and sharing our data publicly so that it can be used by anyone, both locally and globally, for research, education, and management and policy. So that was a lot in one presentation, and I'm sure there's time for questions, but if anyone wants to contact me afterwards, then that is my email address, and you can scan the QR code and it will take you to the Trash Trap Network website as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you. Hey, Hannah, you're now on the screen too, because we'll go into our Q&A. So we have some time for questions. So for those of you that are online, if you have a question to ask, you can raise your hand or you can ask it in the chat, and Rafaela is watching. And then for those of you in the room, you can simply raise your hand and ask a question. And I already see one in the back. And so these questions can be for Gloria, Alice, or Hannah. So go ahead when you ask your question, just sure, and turn on the light if you want, might make it. Perfect. Okay. Go ahead and ask your question.
First two speakers, thank you for your thoughts. Attacking the source is a good thing, but to change the people's activities or the construction company's activities, you have to change the law. Do you know what the government is doing in the city and then province and then federally? I think Canada is the only developed countries that I live and travel that doesn't require individual like me to distinguish plastic and then all the stuff. I just put everything in and then just dump out. And then it's convenient for me, but it's very bad for environment. And I was shocked. I'm from South Korea. We started like distinguishing everything differently in a different box before 2000. So I was very shocked. And then if you like put everything in, then how can you recycle? Do you know what the government is trying to do? Is that do they have any plans to impose or punish or incentive?
So I'll go first. So for construction foam, as far as I know, there hasn't been any government action regarding how to tackle and mitigate foam leaving or entering the environment from construction sites. So that's definitely something that we want to work towards and push for in our next steps. But that's very interesting that the recycling or like
if you go to Germany, France, I think most European countries are still doing it. But I was like, it's very good because it's very big. Put everything in and then dump out. But how do they recycle? How do they distribute? It's gonna be that, right? So it has to be start from the individual, the source of the garbage that has to be going the different place.
In South Korea, they teach you that in school, or
No, it's a government law.
the government?
Yeah, you have to put all the plastic bag in one plastic bag, the can and all the like food garbage in a different. You have to, otherwise they don't collect.
It's like how we, like our blue bin, what he's saying is mixed. So, and I think, I don't know how many years ago they decided to do this, where they mixed the blue bin instead of having people sort their plastic, their paper, their cans. They did it because they thought it would help people recycle more. I think now they're realizing that it can be a problem because you get such a mixed bag and then you have contaminated recycling. And so I think the city and the federal government is trying to harmonize waste management across the country. I don't know where it will land, but your point is well taken. And I'm not sure that mixing was a good idea.
There's no fine or penalty, like there's no.
No, it's what you're supposed to do here. Yeah, is to mix and put it in your blue bin. There's no fine or penalty for doing it wrong. They did do a study where they looked through people's bins and they put a note. And if you did it wrong, they pushed it back up the driveway, but it was just an educational campaign. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a comment kind of on that. In
Talk really
Northern
loud.
Ontario, you have to separate your garbage still. I don't think they don't do one bin. You have kind of your paper and then everything else for recycling. And then when I lived in Ottawa, it was something similar. I don't know if that's just like Toronto or.
It differs around the country.
Very different experiences in different municipalities of whether they compost or not, whether they even collect paper recycling where you have to bring it somewhere, or else they won't take anything. So it differs a lot between municipalities.
Yeah, or it'd be like if you end up mixing your garbage, they just won't pick it up.
Mhm.
They just leave it and then put it.
Any other questions for this panel? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, do you know if there's any alternatives to foam? Since that's such a big problem.
So, yeah, that one's a tricky one because there are definitely alternatives, like I've heard of, like, back in the 50s, apparently they were using horsehair, but you know, that, like, how good is it? Because, you know, we don't want those buildings to burn down, so it's like a fine line between, in our case, I don't know, maybe there are better alternatives, but like so far, there hasn't been one that's been created. So the most that we can do as is this, like, is just sort of mitigate that. That's definitely.
Question in the back, yeah.
Yeah, so on the policy side, of things, if like you get something in place, you get an authority fine for producing this sort of solution. How are like, what are your thoughts on like how you would approach, I guess, trying to identify where that, like you can identify like this track of construction, but it's a lot harder to sort of start to narrow that down. So I'm curious if like you're familiar with any of that type of work doing something like that, or how you might go about that.
Do you mean like specifically like penalizing, like something that's.
Well, I mean, I guess not necessarily penalizing, but like once you identify like these are like the overall sources of trash, like is there like what does the next layer look like? Or like is there another layer more specifically identifying trash?
Yeah, I think this is for me or for Alex.
I think you both talk about politics, but it's like.
I just think like there's different ways to go about it. Like there's some studies that identify the specific companies. Like there's a study where they collected the trash that washed up on this island in the middle of the Pacific, and they found that Coca-Cola and Pepsi were the most, like all the bottles, most of the bottles came from so you can, you know, that's very specific, but then there's other studies that just look at broad sources. And I think that information is, both types of information is helpful. And sometimes you can't identify the company because the label is so worn out, or but you can still do something with that. Just depends on what kind of policy you're.
I think,
I have a question from,
yeah, one question online.
to all of you, this kind of, and it's come from Laura. In terms of education, what is the biggest, can you hear me?
Yeah.
In terms of education, what is the biggest myth or misconception the average person has about plastic pollution, or if there is anything particular your research has uncovered that isn't common knowledge that you wish more people knew?
Ooh, that's good. Why don't you each answer that, and then we'll go on to the second panel, and then we should have time for your question after that, for the next round. A good question.
Yeah, we can go first.
Yeah. So I I touched on it a little bit in my talk, but essentially, I think a lot of people in this room, when I asked like, who knew anything about construction foam, not a lot of people put their hands up. And I think really when we're thinking specifically about plastic foam, a lot of people think that it's from like food containers, which is the general perception, but based on my research, like greater than 50% of the stuff that if the foam found in the environment isn't actually from that, or sorry, greater than 50% of the foam found in the environment is specifically from construction. So I think that's like a really big thing that even I wasn't aware of before I started this project. So,
Yeah, I also mentioned in my talk, but well, my greatest pet peeve is people think I'm gonna solve all their problems for them, which I'll try, but at the end of the day, we all need to work together. And we all have something to do, and it's not every group, like the individual communities and government and companies, they all have something that.
Hannah, your turn.
I would say that a common misconception that I found, particularly through the trash trap network, is that people assuming that the plastic pollution problem is something that's happening far away in the middle of the ocean and not something that's happening locally. And so it's interesting to see how by putting these devices in amongst local communities and people seeing them and what they're capturing and seeing firsthand everything that they're pulling out of the water, I think it really brings it home that it's a very local issue, and just because you're not seeing it on the streets, it's still in the environment and in places you might not be looking. So that's definitely something I think more people should know.
Okay, well, thank you all. Let's give this panel another round of applause. And to keep us on time, we'll go to our second panel. So if you still had a lingering question, hopefully we have time for more questions after this panel. We should. Okay, so bear with me while I deal with technology. Okay. So if someone in the back can dim the lights for us again, that would be great. And then our next panel, so we have three. So first we're going to start with Zoë Ungku Fa'iz, and Zoe's going to talk about plastic leaching from landfills. This is a new project we've worked on, so trying to understand landfills as a source. Zoë is a material science undergrad here at University of Toronto, and she was introduced to the world of microplastics through our trash trapping program. Actually, we have a project called Fighting Floatables on Toronto's waterfront, and Zoë was quantifying and characterizing litter in sea bins, not every day this summer, but almost every day on the waterfront. And so she can tell you a lot of the data that Hannah was talking about. And as I said, she's currently working on characterizing and quantifying microplastics being emitted from landfills as leachate. So pretty interested to see what her results are. I'm not sure we have a ton for you yet because we just got the samples. Our next speaker will be Jacob Haney. So Jacob received his honors bachelor's in environmental science from Carleton University, and we stole him from Ottawa to come here and do his master's in our lab at University of Toronto. He's studying the transport and fate of micro and macroplastics in urban streams, particularly the Don River, which some of you may be familiar with. This is a project that also looks at rivers both in Chicago as well as in the New Hampshire area, but tonight he'll probably focus on our local river. And additionally, he will be conducting some pretty fun microcosm or mesocosm experiments this summer, trying to study the effect of those plastics on the macrobenthic invertebrates, or those little animals that live within the sediments of the stream. So Jacob joined us this summer to work on a project, quickly got oriented in the lab, and has been leading a team of students on the Don River every day. What he didn't share with you is all of the weird and wonderful things he's pulled out of the Don River and even made furniture out of them in his house. So maybe he'll sneak away to share that with you as well. And then last but not least will be Madeleine Milne. And Madeleine is going to be talking about her work looking at microplastics in fish, and particularly thinking about sport fish for human consumption. So we'll sort of end the night thinking about how the plastic in our environment may come back to haunt us. She right now, just graduated, not right now, but a few months ago from U of T in EEB. She's been working in my lab for a few years now on several projects. So she has her hands in many different projects in the lab. And right now she's actually looking at microplastics in food from the grocery store. But don't worry, not in Toronto and Portland, Oregon. So got to be different, right? But she can talk to you about that work as well. And Maddie has been part of the trash team for a really long time, and she actually did the artwork for our theory of change. So she's also a very talented artist. So without further ado, I will stop sharing this slideshow and I will turn it over to Zoe. Pretty easy to figure out what block is yours. Okay, get out of your way.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name's Zoe and part of the second panel, we're going to talk about fate and effects of plastic pollution to inform processes and risks. So I've been working with Chelsea for coursework at U of T, and we're trying to see how microplastics get into the landfill and are also created in the landfill and end up in landfill leachate. So here we have some landfills across the world. It's a global issue. We start with, on the far left, it's one of the largest landfills on Earth in Nevada. And then we move on to China. And at first I was going to put one in Italy, but then I read about how Italy and some other places, they transport their landfill contents to other countries because there's just not enough space anymore. So instead, this was landfill contents that were transported to Malaysia, where I grew up. Not specifically there, but and then lastly, we have on the right landfill just north of here in Blue Mountains, which we are studying the contents of the landfill leachate right now. So based on projections of economic and social urbanization and just consumer buying habits in general, by 2050, it's projected that we're going to have about 3.2 billion metric tons of trash on our Earth. And if you want a comparison, that's kind of like 32 million blue whales. So that's a lot of trash, and we're kind of buried under this problem. And under all these landfills is what comes out as what we know commonly, or like today with Toronto's garbage pickup, garbage juice, also known as landfill leachate. So we're going to start small. We're going to explain what landfill leachate is, understanding my research, which we're finding microplastics in the landfill leachate, and then why you should care. So landfill leachate is kind of like a cocktail of moisture that's formed when gases are given off by solid waste that's decomposing every day in landfills. And it also harbors, it's a great site for microbial activities. And from this, it can also contain microplastics. They can either be macro microplastics, or they can either be primary microplastics or secondary microplastics. Primary being they were initially made to be small. They can be plastic pellets from production companies, or like, for example, microbeads that have now been banned but are still in our landfills decomposing. And they can also be secondary microplastics, which used to be large pieces of plastic broken down into small plastic over time. So there's many ways that the microplastics travel through leachate pathways. So this is specifically to the landfill in Blue Mountains that we're working with. They have two types of landfill. They have one that's lined so that all the landfill leachate can be filtered into a sand and cloth filter, and that gives you the pre-treated landfill leachate, and then they oxidize it to treat the hydrogen sulfide, which makes it smelly, and that's caused by when things are decomposing. And then the post-treated sample, the post-treated landfill leachate ends up in our wastewater treatment plant for further treatment. And the second way is kinds that don't get filtered. They get contained into a well and eventually released into our groundwater. So in this study, we're looking at three types of samples: the ones before treatment, after treatment, and also the well water. And we are trying to classify and count the microplastics in each kind. Yeah, so we also want, by studying these three types, we can determine whether their treatment is effective and if they need to alter things in their landfill system. So this is kind of to get an idea of where we're getting the samples from, and the leachate tanks, which are physical tanks that you just turn the tap, and they collected them for us. They sent us some landfill leachate in bottles. And then in the lab, what we've been doing so far is stacking seeds of different sizes to collect different size microplastics. And then we end up with 3 different size fractions. Here are most of the samples. And so far, I don't have too much done. We only started about 2 months ago and the samples arrived 2 weeks ago. But so far, there have been colored fibers in the larger sieve sizing, and that's just for the pre-treated leachate. And we'll compare that with controls. So that's bottles that were not filled, just to see if there's any contamination in the lab. And we've also seen that there is sediment forming over time. So that might be from organic matter that is fermenting in the landfill leachate. So that might need some separation or digestion so that we can count the microplastics. And for data analysis, it will be analysis of variance, and we will also use previously studied landfill leachate in China. They used these equations to calculate the concentration of plastic particles per liter of leachate. So now finally for the part of why you should care and why it's important. Once this is done, the town of Blue Mountains, they'll have more data to base off of when deciding whether they should change the ways they are currently filtering and treating their landfill leachate, and seeing if there can be ways to treat the well water samples instead of just releasing them straight into the groundwater if there are microplastics in them.
Thank you. Okay. So then next up will be Jacob. So once that plastic gets into the environment from the landfill or from wherever it is, how does it transport? Particularly in our river network. You got it. Yeah.
Okay. So, hi everyone, my name is Jacob. It's my pleasure to talk to you today about my research and the plastic spiraling in river networks project that we're currently doing over the summer. This is a collaborative project. It's a collaborative project between the University of Toronto, the University of New Hampshire, and Loyola University, Chicago. So to kick it off, we have to understand what we know and what we don't know about plastic pollution in rivers. Recent modeling estimates that 80% of global emission of plastic comes from approximately 1,000 rivers. Also, that from these rivers, 0.8 to 2.7 million metric tons of plastic waste is emitted into larger reservoirs, such in our case, lakes like the Great Lakes, and also oceans per year. It's also noted that small urban rivers are major players in this transport of plastic. That also provides a great opportunity for mitigation and collection of these debris while they're still kind of concentrated before they get into larger reservoirs where it's very difficult to actually clean them up. So that's kind of what we know a little bit, kind of. But what we don't know is how plastic debris actually behaves once it's in a river, how long it stays in rivers. Also, factors like the physical size of plastic or material matter in its transport downstream. So these current research gaps, these current research gaps fuel our main research questions and interest in this project. So we're trying to figure out how plastic pollution actually moves through a river network. So not just one site located on the river, but the actual whole river, as well as what kind of impact hydrological variability, basically water flow, have in transporting plastic pollution. So in a nutshell, we're trying to understand what happens to plastic when the river goes from looking like this in our kind of base flow condition to looking like this. This is our storm flow, and then back to base flow. So we're trying to understand how plastic debris transport and fluxes change depending on flow conditions. So what are concentrations of macro and microplastics during base flow or kind of the normal river flow? As we can see in this photo, this is actually one of our sites on the Don River. This is Taylor Massey Creek, where we sampled. And we wanted to compare those kind of base flow conditions to storm flow conditions or concentrations of plastic
where we have a lot more water and energy in the system. So in theory, should have a lot more plastic being mobilized, as well as you have plastic coming from the surrounding landscape into the main river through like runoff. But then we also want to look at the concentrations of plastic once the river returns back to base flow. So is plastic still lingering in the system, and how long is it lingering? So going into this project, we had the idea that plastic debris, particularly microplastic, act similar to natural elements that are transported in rivers, such as nitrogen and phosphorus. And they follow something called nutrient spiraling. Nutrient spiraling describes the cycling of nutrients as they're assimilated from the water column into the stream bed, into the sediments, where they could be either temporarily retained or kind of more permanently retained. Then some of that material can be resuspended back into the water column as it's transported downstream. So it's kind of spiraling. We plan on using the concept of nutrient spiraling to create a plastic dynamics model, a kind of a river network scale, so looking at the whole river, to describe and predict fluxes of plastic pollution in lakes and oceans, a kind of a global scale based on the data we collected in the field during the summer. So we collected data from 3 different watersheds in North America, all around this similar latitude and climate conditions. We have the Don River watershed, which is where we are in Toronto. We also have our colleagues working in Chicago, and they sampled the Chicago River, or the North Branch Chicago River watershed, and also the Ipswich, which is located near Boston, Massachusetts. So each of these watersheds is kind of unique in its size and also the land use that's inside that watershed, as well as the population density, so the people living in those areas. So that will hopefully give us kind of a well-rounded data set to work from that we can extrapolate out to more kind of what's going on globally. In each watershed, we had 4 sites where we collected microplastic samples, but also macroplastic samples. So I should also mention macro. When we talk about macro, it's anything that's larger than 5 millimeters in size. So it can go from, I don't know, the size of a small piece of foam all the way up to like a car tire, versus micro is anything that's smaller than 5 millimeters in size. So yeah, so 2 of the sites were on the main stem of the rivers, and then 2 are in tributaries. Tributaries are just kind of branches of the river that flow back into that main stem. So at each site, we collected different samples at different times. During base flow conditions, we collected surface water samples, water column samples, and also sediment samples for microplastics, and conducted stream surveys, and collection transects were for macroplastics. We followed these collection methods for our baseline sampling, pre-storm, and also post-storm sampling events. So we ended up spending this summer a lot of time in the river picking up garbage from our macroplastic transects, and we picked up a lot of interesting things. Also in that bottom photo, you could see that's how we collected a surface water sample. So we just wanted those first couple of centimeters of the water column. This was a little bit different for during storms, or we're not able to get into the river. It wasn't really safe. So we use an auto sampler, which is basically like a little robot to collect water column samples over the course of a storm, to hopefully capture any changes in the concentration of plastic, and then also what type of plastic is there. We also mounted cameras to bridges that kind of overlooked our sites on the river to record any floating macroplastic debris during storms. So that top image is like, it's hard to see, but that's kind of our camera setup, that little white box. And then the bottom image is our auto sampler. So with that being said, we collected like a gazillion samples. So we have a lot of work to do to be able to get any kind of results from this analysis, but it's in process. So on the left, this is kind of our microplastic samples with all these tiny jars. And on the right, we have a whole lab that's full of garbage bags that we have to go through. But since this is PowerPoint, I can just gloss over that and move to other cool things that we did in the summer. So also in the summer, we teamed up with Ocean Conservancy to add 50 tracking water bottles to the Don River. This again is to understand how floating litter actually moves through a river, how it's retained and resuspended based on flow conditions. A lot of current modeling treats rivers like pipes, but they're dynamic and full of a lot of obstacles like woody debris dams. like that photo you see on the right, they kind of catch and retain garbage and then possibly let go of it. This data is again being used to train a model we plan to extrapolate to kind of a global scale to say how plastic moves through rivers and different emissions into larger reservoirs. This model could also be used to inform what are the best locations to put trash trapping technology, like Hannah was talking about, to maximize our efforts and dollars in cleaning up litter. So this is where it's very convenient. I want to introduce the litter getter, which is part of the Lost Free initiative. This company actually reached out to us and asked for our preliminary data from the Don River to determine if there was a site where they could install this kind of contraption that acts as a boom that collects garbage into like a bin, basically, and then it can be removed. So it's pretty neat to see our research, even though we haven't really scratched the surface in processing it, is already being used to implement like a mitigation effort. So where do we go from here? For my own research now, that we have the idea of macro and microplastic concentrations present in the environment, we can start to ask questions about what are the effects on biota, also things like if flow condition matters, as well as maybe this changing landscape with flow, if that has an effect on biota too. So we have a lot of things that we want to get to with that. But I just want to thank you for listening and also give a big thank you to the team we have in Toronto who made all this sampling possible. So thanks.
Maybe those people are.
They're here.
Yeah, I recognize them. Okay, awesome. Now we will move into fish. So Maddie, last but not least. I think there's a picture of you holding a fish. There you go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Madeleine. As Chelsea mentioned, I just graduated from the University of Toronto and I now work as a researcher in the Rochman Lab. Today, I'm going to be talking a bit about my undergraduate thesis work, which is looking at microplastics in sport fish from Lake Ontario. I'll just give a bit of background about microplastics. I mean, you've heard a lot today, but just so everyone's on the same page. Microplastics are defined as plastic pieces less than 5 millimeters in size. And they come from a wide range of sources, which means they're an extremely diverse contaminant. So they can be a variety of shapes, sizes, colors, polymers, and have different additives. Here on the right, you can see a couple of the categories that we use to categorize microplastics. For example, fragments, which come from the breakdown of larger plastic items, fibers, which come off your clothes, and rubber, which comes from the wear of tires. Because microplastics are so small, they can often inadvertently enter the environment where they can persist there indefinitely because they're so resistant to breaking down. As a result, organisms often accidentally consume microplastics, and there are a lot of questions surrounding the fate of microplastics in the environment in terms of organisms themselves and the food web more broadly. My project aims to investigate some of these questions to better understand the fate of microplastics, particularly in the context of human exposure to microplastics through fish. As an overview of my project, I looked at 6 species of sport fish caught from Lake Ontario from the Humber Bay area right near Toronto, so a really polluted site. And I looked at 2 tissues from each of the fish, the gut and the fillet. And I was interested in the gut because this is sort of the short-term storage of microplastics from direct ingestion. So it kind of gives us a snapshot in time of the microplastics that a fish might have eaten, whereas the fillet is more long-term storage of microplastics over time. And this is the muscle tissue of the fish, which is what we eat. So it's of interest for understanding human exposure to microplastics. For both tissues, I counted the particles under a microscope so that I was able to get a count of the particles and characterize what was found in the fish. I'll briefly go through my methods. So I started by dissecting the fish to remove the 2 tissues that I was interested in. I put the samples through chemical digestion procedures, which liquefied the tissue, but didn't damage the plastic particles that was in it. I then rinsed away all the chemicals and I was able to pick through and pick out all the microplastics. And then I took photos and measurements of all the plastic particles that I found. And then a subset I put through chemical identification
using Hannah's library. So I was able to identify the polymer types, which helps us understand whether what I was picking out actually was plastic, and also kind of indicate some of potentially the sources of microplastics in the fish. I observed microplastics in both tissues that I looked at in all the species. When I combined the counts from both tissues to give a measurement of how many microplastics were in the fish, on average, I saw 137 particles per fish, which is extremely high. So in North America, the average number of microplastics per fish is only 15.5. So this is extremely high. And even more shocking, the highest number of particles I saw in a single fish was 1,508 particles. And this is higher than what's been reported in other studies from the Great Lakes and even from Lake Ontario. And this visualizes the data for you. So it's kind of a lot to look at, but on the left, I have the gut in purple. And then on the right in yellow, I have the fillets. And along the bottom, I have each of the species that I looked at. So brown bullhead, largemouth bass, northern pike, rock bass, smallmouth bass, and white sucker. And then just in the brackets is the number of samples I looked at. And then along the y-axis is the count. And what was interesting is that for the gut, the two species that I saw the highest counts were the brown bullhead and white sucker. And so this kind of makes sense because those are two fish with similar feeding strategy of being bottom feeders. So they're exposed to a lot of plastic that's sinking down to the bottom of the lake as they're feeding. As well, for the most part, I saw more contamination in the gut than in the fillets, which was what we expected. We expected to see a lot more plastic making its way into the gut through direct ingestion, but that there would be less in the fillets due to barriers for microplastics to transfer through the fish itself. However, there was one exception. So for the northern pike, you can see here that in the fillet, there was actually more microplastics than in the gut, which was a little bit weird, and we don't really know why. And as well, my work is applied to understand human health exposure. So I scaled the data to understand how many microplastics you would eat in a single serving of fish of 227 grams. And so there's a wide range, and on average, you would consume 123 microplastics in a single serving of fish. But there's high variability between different fish and species. So you could eat between 0 and 854 particles in a single serving. That said, this is just one pathway of consuming microplastics, so it might be a pretty minor source compared to, for example, drinking water or other more commonly consumed foods. Overall, my project is in collaboration with the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, who has projects to look at contamination from a bunch of different contamination for fish. And so they produce guidelines, like you can see this poster, which are posted, you might see them down at the waterfront, and they tell you the safe levels of consumption of different kinds of fish that people are recreationally fishing for. So the goal is for the data from my project to help contribute to these recommendations, adding plastic as a factor. My work kind of focuses on exposure. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of data on risk to humans, so I can't really say what the impact is on human health at this point, but hopefully future work will address that. And also, as Chelsea mentioned, my current work is looking at other sources of exposure to microplastics in humans. So I'm looking at food from the grocery store right now. So hopefully we'll have a better picture of how many microplastics you're actually eating in a daily basis. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Okay, we definitely have time for questions. Maddie, go ahead and take a seat. And then if there are questions on the Zoom, again, just raise a hand or ask it in the chat, and Rafaela will be watching. And then questions in the room, of course, go ahead and raise your hand and we can call on you. Does anyone want to get us started on questions? And Ludo, maybe. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Anyone have questions?
Just from like the individual level, let's talk about microplastics. I read years ago how horrible that so much comes off of our textiles and the laundry, and I just wondering like that getting to sell another thing, or would you involve like actually catch other fish and trap the source, like to reduce how much we're making?
We've just, I guess I'll answer this. We've tested it actually. So the students who studied it aren't here. They've both graduated and since left us for greener pastures. But we basically did a study where we looked at how much microfibers came off of fleeces in the wash. So we have a washing machine in the lab and then, or in a colleague's lab. And then we tested both the Cora ball. So for those of you, it sort of looks like, I don't know, do you remember those toys like the koosh balls? It's like a little ball with things coming off of it and it's meant to trap the microfibers that are coming off your clothes. And this is just lint, basically, if you think about laundry lint. And then we also tested a filter that sits outside your washing machine and brings the water through and filters it. The Cora ball didn't do a ton. The filters removed like 90%. So we've put that work forward as a policy brief, and Lisa Erdl, who led a lot of that work, she published her work and basically said, not that everyone should have to buy an aftermarket filter, but basically that they should put filters in washing machines at the point of manufacturing. And there's been a bill written in Ontario to do just that. So you don't have to go out and buy a Cora ball. You can buy an aftermarket filter if you want, but there are policies moving down the pipeline to put filters on washing machines. Yeah, yeah. Yes, of course. Yes, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Oh, yeah, is the number of plastics that you found that per fit, is that by any unit of mass?
So the number that I reported, like that first figure, is just, like, yeah, the total count like per fish based on like both fillets and the gut. For other data, like for the like how much you would eat, that's scaled by the mass of the tissue itself.
And the what you compared it to the average, that wasn't like there's no information on that scale by now?
There might be. I only remember them talking about just like a count. But also like another step of my project that I haven't gotten to yet is that I'm going to be measuring like a mass concentration measurement of microplastics. So I'll be able to compare like the mass that's in the fillets of plastic to a count. So I'll hopefully be able to do a direct comparison there as well.
This question's from Madeleine as well. I was just curious if you ran into one who were fishing, and if you happened to talk to them, or if they actually ate the fish, and if they were maybe even aware of the study that you were doing that affected.
Yeah, I always wonder about people fishing in Upper Bay. I always wonder about like people fishing and if they are actually eating the fish there. So I didn't get to go out and fish. It was it was like 2 years ago during COVID. The ministry went out and they do electrofishing. So they didn't just angle for these fish. They get them like all at once. But yeah, that is something I'm always very curious about. I don't think there's as much fishing right at Humber Bay as like other areas in Ontario, but it is a good like case study to understand like near urban sites, like where pollution is higher, the fish are more contaminated.
I think it's eventually the government's goal, because they're trying to understand how much is there and then what they need to do about that. Do they need to report it when they have the seafood guides? Does microplastic need to be included? Yeah, so TBD. Yeah. Other questions? And are there questions online, Rafaela? Okay. Oh, yeah.
Jacob?
Jacob, sorry.
Yeah.
Jacob, in your study, have you been able to localize like places where there is a higher retention of plastic already, or then you need to process those that appears on the whole length of the body?
I think we need to process the data more to say anything about that. But yeah, from what we found, like just processing just a couple of samples, actually looking at the plastic and counting it, it seems that storm events are like very important in transporting plastic, but particularly rare.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question for Gloria. If you want to answer
I won't say.
if anybody else has.
We have time, even if they do. Go ahead. Got 7
I'm
minutes.
just curious if
in the environment. Oh, yeah, it definitely, like, I didn't touch on that, but, the reason why it's not great peptide litter in the environment, especially, construction foam, is because they have a. Probably, yeah.
I have a question for Ms. Faiz. You talked about garbage dumps in China and in Malaysia, and even in Canada, dumps are something that are out of the public sphere. We don't look at them. So I wonder what you've learned about how different countries deal with their waste and if it's equitable across the whole world.
Yeah, recently there was a researcher from Denmark who visited, and he mentioned how in Denmark, because when I was doing some background research, they have the most garbage per capita. But it's also that their first source isn't to send them to the landfill now, it's more to burn them, incinerate them and create energy, but that also creates more carbon dioxide. That's one way people are handling it. And a lot of landfills I noticed when I was trying to find papers on them, they close. So when there's no more space, they just close them. And I think in Northern Ontario, there's also they call it a ghost site, because a lot of people, when they introduce it to the community, the idea of a landfill, no one wants that in their backyard. So there are locations where we might have to start using them if people continue to not reduce and plastic and stuff, or contaminated plastic that doesn't get recycled. Oh, like one point I missed just now was that 60% of all the plastic that's ever created is, and it keeps regenerating and degrading, it ends up in the landfill, and less than 20% of all our plastic gets recycled in general. So
Thank you.
I have a question for you too. So you present two ways, that the one with the filter and another without the filter. Yeah, that's correct. So if you don't have a filter, what do you? The filter is just is only to collect microplastics, the small particles, or
so from the people at the landfill mentioned, so it's a stand-in cloth filter, so that's just to take out the large pieces of plastic. Yeah, so all the small pieces that don't get filtered out. So the well water ones, they just go back into the ground.
and how do they treat that?
That one they don't treat. Yeah, so that was their old version, the online one, and then now they have the line one, but they haven't gotten rid of it.
Is that close?
I'm not sure, but
I'm asking because I visited one landfill in Brazil, and it's an open, it's like a swimming pool, but it's a black one. It's very shocking. No, I understand the system is probably better, but how better it is to capture small particles or bigger.
I have a question for Jacob. So what were some of the interesting things you found in the
Team him up.
Yeah, we found a bunch of different things. We found a lot of safes actually, it's kind of interesting, near the highway, they were kind of broken into and disposed of in the river. So pretty interesting. I ended up convincing everyone to help me haul one of the safes out of the river up the ravine. And then I brought it home and turned it into a nightstand.
Yeah. But also like lots of golf balls and
Yeah,
tires.
we would be sampling, especially we had one like right beside a golf course, and we had like a two pieces of green, and people would kind of shoot over back into the golf course, and we'd be like sampling, and then golf balls would be landing in the water.
A lot of wet wipes.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of garbage. You should see the lab. He was, showed a picture of. Yeah. We'll do 2 more questions. Yeah, yours, and then you'll do the final one.
I think it's near. It's on the main stem near.
I think it's Pottery Road, right? That they're interested in, upstream of Pottery Road. Which is right by like brickwork, so. Mhm.
Jacob, were there particular locations along the Don where you found like quite a bit more garbage than other parts? And can you check on like where those areas are and the source of maybe?
Yeah, when we analyze kind of more, especially from our transects for the macroplastic, like the larger litter. Figure out more, and then we can kind of associate with that with like land use around the different sites. But just anecdotally, it's more downstream is a lot dirtier. So it's kind of what you would expect, because garbage would funnel in, especially as you get more, like the Don River stretches pretty far north. So the more northern side, there's less garbage because there's less people, different types of land use. When you get down, our like our most downstream site was pretty urbanized at Pottery Road. So there was a lot more garbage. But then that being said, we also had a tributary that ran through a more urban area, Taylor Creek, and then possibly has some influence from like wastewater, like mismanaged wastewater. So that was very dirty. Going.
Lines, sewer overflow.
Yeah, something like that. Like stormwater overflowed the sewer, and that's where we had all these wipes that we got washed.
Okay, well, thank you. Give him one more round of applause. And I think it is 7 on the dot. So I first want to thank everyone for coming. It's really wonderful to see so many people in the room, so many people in the Zoom room. So thanks everyone. Thank you to our speakers. And if people have time, I think there's a couple students in the room that actually wanted to try to run a survey for their class.